These are the 5 points of Calvinism. In this video, I will point out the biblical problems with TULIP. I previously made a video on the U of TULIP, unconditional election, which focused primarily on Romans 9, the favorite text of the Calvinist camp, where God chooses Jacob and rejects Esau. Having demonstrated at length that Romans 9 does not teach that God has predestined the fate of every individual, some to heaven and some to hell, and that passage is concerned with the temporary hardening of Israel in Paul's time instead, we need now to consider the rest of the New Testament and its relationship, or lack thereof, with the Calvinist scheme. But first, a quotation. All Calvinists agree that God foreordained sin and evil because everything is foreordained by God. Admittedly, some untutored people who think they are Calvinists may not believe this, but every Calvinist theologian going back to Calvin himself affirms it. This comes from Roger Olson in his excellent monograph against Calvinism. The reason I begin here is many people who think they are Calvinists are not actually Calvinists, and many who tout their Calvinism the loudest seem to misunderstand its most basic features. This is never more true than when talking about God foreordaining something negative, whether it be the loss to destruction or some tragic or sinful act in history. When God foreordains someone to go to hell, some people mistakenly believe that Calvinism puts God in a somewhat responsive role. That is, when someone of their own choosing follows evil and unbelief, God foreordains this in the sense that he can direct their evil in such a way as to promote good for his people or to promote his own glorification. This is not what Calvinism means by the phrase permissive will. Calvinism does not simply mean that God permits bad things that he can direct to serve his purposes. Most non-Calvinists believe this. I believe this. Rather, Calvinism suggests that the person only becomes evil in the first place as a direct consequence of God willing their reprobate status into existence. He does not simply direct a person's evil to suit his purposes. His purpose for making that person was so that their evil could come into existence in such a way that it has to transpire with no possible alternative. God does not simply permit a person's evil because in his sovereignty he can make it work in his plan. A person's unbelief and sinfulness is the lot that God chose for them to have, and there never was a possible alternative scenario, and God never intended to rescue them from it, according to Calvinism. If that is not the way you have understood Calvinism, allow me to quote some important Calvinist teachers. As I quote Calvinist theologians, I'm going to give book titles and page numbers because I don't want Calvinists to watch this and accuse me of misquoting Calvinist teachers. Now, Bettner is considered the father of American Calvinism. R.C. Sproul and John Piper are standing on the shoulders of Bettner and his influence. He says, "We Calvinists believe that from all eternity, God has intended to leave some of Adam's posterity in their sins, and that the decisive factor in the life of each is to be found only in God's will." Page 104 of the Reformed Doctrine of Predestination. Now notice what he says here. God always intended to leave some of Adam's posterity in their sins. And furthermore, the decisive factor in the life of each is to be found only in God's will. So in other words, it's not that God in his foreknowledge saw that a person would corrupt themselves, and so he said, okay, I'm going to let this happen because I can direct it to an ends that works for me, that works for my plans and purposes. Rather, the reason a person became evil and was destroyed in turn was because God always intended them to be that way, right? It's not that he launched a rescue operation and the person refused to respond, which is the way non-Calvinist Christians have always viewed this. It's rather that God did not effect a rescue operation for most people because he always intended for them to be evil and he always intended them to be destroyed in turn. When they become evil, they are simply responding to God's will and purposes for their life. That is the reason they were made, in order to be evil and in order to be destroyed, because God always intended it. These dark ideas about people being predestined to hell in such a way that they were never intended to escape Go back to John Calvin himself. This doesn't come from hyper-Calvinists later on. It comes straight from Calvin. He says this in the Institutes. God once established by his eternal and unchangeable plan those whom he long before determined once for all to receive into salvation, and those whom, on the other hand, he would devote to destruction. Therefore, those whom God passes over, he condemns, and this he does for no other reason than that he wills to exclude them from the inheritance which he predestines for his own children. Now highlight this. Their condemnation, he says, he does it for no other reason than that he wills to exclude them from the inheritance. So this is not foreknowledge. It's not that God looks ahead and sees that some individuals are going to corrupt themselves. And so he responds by saying, okay, I will let them corrupt themselves because their corruption and their destruction is something I can work into my plan. No, no. The reason they are corrupt and the reason they are destroyed is because God willed this into existence. He chose this for them for no reason that is pertinent to their own decisions in life. He simply chose this for them because this is what he wanted. He wills to exclude them from the inheritance. R.C. Sproul is one of the most identifiable Calvinist teachers of our time. In fact, it was R.C. Sproul who initially persuaded me to be a Calvinist years ago. And I want to include a couple of citations from him since he is so well respected. The Calvinist view of predestination, teaches that from all eternity God has chosen to intervene in the lives of some people and bring them to saving faith, and has chosen not to do that for other people. From all eternity, without any prior view of our human behavior, God has chosen some unto election and others unto reprobation. It's so important that he includes this clause, without any prior view of our human behavior. Again, God, when he selects someone to damnation, it's not because he's looking at who you're going to be or what your belief patterns are going to be. Rather, he has a plan, and his plan means that some get saved and some don't, and so he is selected. And then your life, your unbelief or your belief, your evil or your good, these are direct consequences of the plan that he has put in place for your life. This is predestination. Sproul again. If there is such a thing as predestination at all, and if that predestination does not include all people, then we must not shrink from the necessary inference that there are two sides to predestination. It is not enough to talk about Jacob. We must also consider Esau. Here he is referring to the passage in Romans 9 where God chooses Jacob and rejects Esau before they're ever born. I dealt with this at length in a previous video. Sproul, like other Calvinists, fundamentally misunderstand what Romans is about. Romans 9 is not a discussion on people being predestined to heaven or hell. It's a discussion about the temporary hardness that has come upon the Jewish people that, according to Romans 11, God is going to lift with the passing of time. And so, look, we could multiply citations showing that popular and well-respected Calvinists believe that people are not evil of their own designs, but rather they're evil due to God's design for their life. That God is not simply responding to someone's evil and incorporating it into his plans and purposes. Rather, their evil is a direct response to God's plan for their life, and they are damned in turn. This is a very dark theology. And if we're going to tell people, as the Apostle John does, that God is light and that God is love, then we need to have a view of God that is consistent with what we're saying about God. Because this is, I find it to be very evident, very self-evident. I shouldn't have to explain to you that this is incredibly dark and terrible. This is the way that the new atheism sees God, as a kind of dark tyrant in the sky, arbitrarily damning people for no faults of their own. The Calvinists and the new atheists have essentially the same theology. It's just the Calvinists have chosen to warm up to the dark tyrant, and the new atheists have decided they don't want anything to do with him. But in terms of a cosmic tyrant who is extremely unfair, Calvinism and the New Atheism, they have the exact same view of God. That is not a caricature. That is true. Now, I've shown at length that Calvinists believe a person only becomes evil and goes to hell because God first determined that that is how they should be. But now we need to move on to Calvinism's view of providence, which is normally called particular providence, that every act of tragedy and evil that happens in creation finds its initial conception in the mind of God. Now, it's not the case that God, in his foreknowledge, looks into the creation and that acts of evil and tragedy will occur which are birthed out of the broken creation, out of the broken lives of men and women, and that God will simply use it for its purposes. That's what non-Calvinists believe. The Calvinist believes that the act of evil or tragedy first exists in the mind of God, and the only reason it shows up in the broken world of men is because God has chosen for it to occur. God wills it into existence. God does not permit any alternative scenario. His sovereign will ensures that the act of evil or tragedy will necessarily take place. Think of every act of violence, every school shooting, every mass shooting, every domestic assault, every act of child molestation, every child placed in Hitler's crematoria. God is not simply allowing these things, according to Calvinism, because he can use them. God willed these things into existence. Before they showed up in the brokenness of creation, they showed up in the mind, the will, and the purposes of God. And they only come into the creation because God willed for them to come into creation. Is this a caricature, or is this something that Calvinism actually teaches? John Piper famously published a sermon a few days after the Twin Towers terrorist events of September 11, 2001, declaring that God did not merely permit them, but caused them. And look at the title of Piper's sermon. Why I do not say God did not cause the calamity, but he can use it for good. Now, this has been the typical non-Calvinist, the traditional view of God's providence and sovereignty, that God does not cause the calamity, but that he can use it for good. Well, Piper dislikes this. He's not willing to say that God did not cause the calamity because Piper believes that God causes all calamities. All the people in those buildings who got so burned up that they eventually jumped out the window, this is God's preordained plan and purpose. He causes it. Even a dirty bomb that levels Minneapolis would be from God, says John Piper. Now, the reason he selects Minneapolis is because this is his hometown. And sometimes Piper will say things like that to disarm you when he's trying to teach this view of particular providence, that God causes all things, including all evil things. He'll even say things like, well, even if it happens to my mother, it's still from God. Now, recently, I've come to suspect that Calvinism's view of providence appeals to the pride of many. In times of tragedy, non-Calvinist Christians consistently have to embrace the mystery. Did this tragedy happen as an act of judgment? Or is this like the blind man in John 9, who was not born blind due to sin or for the purposes of judgment, says Jesus, but so that the glory of God could be manifested? Or is there some other thing that God is trying to accomplish, some other purpose that's not quite this simple? Well, Calvinists do not tend to embrace the mystery in times of tragedy. You'll notice that they act like they know what God is thinking and doing. They got the answers, and without fail, they will claim it's judgment for sin. In David Bentley Hart's book, The Doors of the Sea, Where Was God in the Tsunami of 2004, he explains that when he wrote in a popular news article that tragedies do not necessarily reflect God's will, that the brokenness of creation, along with the dark powers that temporarily rule over our world, they can onset things that do not reflect God's purposes. That many Christians protested loudly and insisted you're wrong, that God did do this tsunami and it was an act of judgment. And upon further inspection, Bentley found that his protesters were always Calvinists. And I found that during the coronavirus scare, while many Christians are slow to pretend that they know what God is thinking, Calvinists have been quick to say that this is definitely judgment, and they rattle off a list of sins that they say are responsible. Uh, you see, when you accept a system where everything is the result of God's providential pre-planning, the result in Calvinist circles has been an utter lack of mystery and a lot of presumptuous arrogance. They think they know exactly what God is doing, and they can tell the rest of us all about it. In each tragedy, without failure, they do so. This view of providence appeals to man's pride because it puts him in the know. And when you get so used to reducing God's plans and purposes down to 5 simple steps in TULIP, well, it becomes very natural to presume upon the mind and purposes of God. There's no mystery. You have a box, you have a formula. God has to fit inside of it. And that makes me very suspicious about Calvinists, that they would put God in this little box, and that they're always so quick to act like they know what's going on when the rest of the church is having to embrace the mystery. Again, is this hyper Calvinism, or is Calvinism actually like this? Well, let's just look at John Calvin. He gives us a specific scenario. He says, let us imagine, for example, a merchant who, entering a wood with a company of faithful men, unwisely wanders away from his companions, and in his wandering comes upon a robber's den, falls among thieves, and is slain. His death was not only foreseen by God's eye, but also determined by his decree. Right? So this is a murder. It's not something that God just simply saw in advance. God determined for it to happen by decree. For it is not said that he foresaw how long the life of each man would extend, but that he determined and fixed the bounds which men cannot pass. God determined that he would die at that moment. Yet, as far as the capacity of our mind is concerned, all things therein seem fortuitous, that is, accidental, or they seem to have just happened by chance, just the natural outworking of worldly events. What will a Christian think at this point? Just this: whatever happened in a death of this sort, he will regard as fortuitous by nature, as it is. Yet he will not doubt that God's providence exercised authority over fortune in directing its end. So in the last slide, Calvin said it happened as a direct result of God's decree, this innocent man's murder. And in this slide, God's providence exercised authority over fortune in directing its ends. So in Calvinism, it's never that something happened as a result of the brokenness of creation, and then God can respond by using it for good. And it's never that the satanic powers do something that is inconsistent with the will of God, but despite whatever mess they make, God can use it for good. This is the non-Calvinist view. In Calvinism, this innocent man's murder is a direct result of God's decree, God's will, God's purpose. It ultimately goes back to God. He planned this to happen to this man. And obviously, we can extrapolate from this every terrible thing that's ever happened to an individual, according to Calvinism, is the direct result of God's purposes. When it comes to God being the ultimate cause for every evil and tragic event in human history, how far is the Calvinist willing to go? Well, as it turns out, down to the very atom and molecule, down to the very thought and desire of the perpetrator. Paul Helm, a British evangelical philosopher and theologian who teaches at Canada's Regent College, who is a Calvinist, he says this: not only is every atom and molecule, every thought and desire kept in being by God, but every twist and turn of each of these is under the direct control of God. Bettner, again, the father of American Calvinism, states, God very obviously predetermined every event which would happen, so that even the sinful acts of men are included in this plan. When non-Calvinists read statements like these, they tell Calvinists that according to your theology, God must be the author of sin. The Calvinist responds by saying he is not the author of sin because even though he's the ultimate cause of evil and tragedy, he is not the direct cause. That there is a series of intermediary stages in between God, who causes these things, and the perpetrator who carries them out. And they think that by employing this indirect language, by making some distance between God and the evil thing that he willed into existence, that they somehow get God and their theology off the hook, that somehow God, under an indirect scenario in terms of him causing evil, that he's somehow no longer the author of sin. So a man throws a punch and hits his wife in the mouth. Uh, God is not guilty here for willing this into existence because he's not the one who threw the punch, and he didn't come down from heaven and tell the man to throw the punch. He might be the force behind the man's elbow, but he's not the direct cause and therefore innocent. Or if that's not indirect enough, we can create some more stages of indirectness in order to satisfy the Calvinist conscience. God is not the grenade that blows up and kills a room full of children. Rather, he's a sniper on a hill who shoots the man throwing the grenade, causing the grenade to bounce off the wall and to land in someone's window, where it lies dormant for 30 minutes until the children enter the room, stir up the grenade, and it blows up. I mean, how many stages of indirectness do we have to employ in order to make God innocent in Calvinist sight, in order to make it where he is not the author of sin? See, I think that most people, including Calvinist people, that they know perfectly well that employing indirect language is not good enough, that this is not somehow going to get God off the hook for willing into existence the bad things that he wills into existence. It's not enough to say that God didn't come down and tell the man to molest the child. He just, in his providence and sovereignty, arranged it so that there was a dark, quiet room available and that no one would interrupt the perpetrator. That doesn't work. The world is too full of darkness, and scriptures tell us that God is too good. You can't make God the cause of all these things and then say that God is not the author of sin just because there are some intermediary stages in between God and the perpetrator. That just is very unconvincing. I'll give John Piper a little bit of credit when he owns his theology. He'll tell you that God caused 9/11, and if a dirty bomb goes off in Minneapolis, that God is the one who caused it. He'll own it, which you have to give him a little bit of credit, because usually Calvinists, in their view of God's sovereignty, they won't own their theology once you start talking about specific terrible scenarios. At least John Piper will. But I notice he still likes to keep it kind of vague, right? He doesn't like to get down in the gritty details with which people are confronted in real life when terrible things happen. So let's talk about Nirbhaya. This young woman was 23 years old, and her brutal rape and murder was an international phenomenon. She leaves a movie theater. She's pictured in the top left, by the way. That's before she was brutalized. In the middle, this is before she dies. Her mother's in the top right. Her perpetrators are on the bottom. She leaves a movie theater with a male companion. They get on a train with several men who have been drinking. On the train, they beat her male companion unconscious. And then they take her and they rape her. And they're extremely brutal. Using a metal rod, they tear up her insides. Uh, some of the perpetrators were only identified through DNA because of the bite marks that they left on her body. And she is brutally murdered in this way. Now let's look at this from a Calvinist point of view. According to Paul Helm, down to the very level of the thoughts and desires of men, and down to the very atom, God was in control of this and guided it and willed it into existence. So, the men, they're drinking, the evil intentions of their heart, the timing that they get onto the bus, on the macro level of human behavior, God causes this. Down to the micro level of atoms, the pain in her nervous system, the electrical circuitry that's firing off, sending pain to her brain, down to the very atom, Paul Helm says, God is in control and that he is causing all things. Now, if you are a Calvinist and you can look at specific scenarios like this one and say that God caused this, that this is part of his plan, that he always purposed this for Nerbhaya and her companion and her perpetrators, then I don't know what to tell you except that I think there's something wrong with you, that you should be slower to say such terrible things about God. The rest of the Christian world is chopping these things up to a broken creation and to satanic powers who are in charge in this age. And there's a time of justice coming when God will change that because he does not desire these sorts of things for his human creation. But if you're a Calvinist, then God wills them into existence. And it's not enough to say that there are intermediary stages. And it's not enough to say that while God wills things into existence, he doesn't actually take pleasure in them. Right? That's just a cop out. I mean, come on. Right? If this is his plan for her and for everyone who's suffered a crime like her, then what basis do we have when we tell people that God is good? We have no basis at all. And this is why Calvinism is not just another theology. Calvinism threatens the very integrity and character of God. And that's why I'm going out of my way to denounce it. I don't go out of my way to denounce many theological systems. But this is terrible when people start thinking and talking this way because you are turning God into a veritable monster.